We have an audience from all over the world here this morning. So I'd firstly thank you for coming. Some of you at Saturday afternoon, some of you at some Sunday morning. The topic of today's presentation is collaboration. I'd like to introduce Marian Shapiro. And Marian Shapiro and I have been collaborating now for some time. We're going to talk a little bit about our most recent and continuing collaboration in progress, which is our series titled Safety Net. Just to give an introduction to this, this series of work is part of a greater collaboration, which is our joint exhibition. So Marian and I are working towards a joint exhibition at the Hawkesbury Regional Gallery, which is in Windsor, New South Wales. And this exhibition, which will be loosely titled Escape Artists, we're still finalising, tweaking the title, is going to be in April 2023. Now, that's getting close. We started this process a couple of years ago and it felt like forever because it was continually delayed and rescheduled, but now we're just over a year away. So this is, we're both working along similar but different complementary themes. And then we decided that as part of that, we would really like to create one of those works as a specific collaboration. So we started to work on the ideas around that, and we got together in the studio and we thought, how can we develop something that speaks to the broader theme of the exhibition, that brings in both of our particular concepts, and it allows us to extend and expand on our previous collaboration of Australia. So Marian, how did our pods get started?
Right, well, I think part of it was the kind of, the time difference between when we actually proposed this and when the exhibition was scheduled, which was 3 years. And obviously the last couple of years, things have changed a lot. And we very much wanted at least one aspect of the exhibition to look at what was happening now rather than, what we were necessarily concerned with 3 years ago when we started all this 2 years ago. So what we really wanted to examine was kind of certain aspects of lockdown particularly, and that kind of conflicting feeling of being sort of simultaneously safe and protected, but also, how much of that is a constraint and a trap. And that whole thing about, we've all been forced with various lockdowns to turn inwards and to find new ways of kind of being alone and being together when you can't kind of physically be together. So that was kind of the area of exploration. In practical terms, we decided that we would do 6 of these, and at a point where we could actually be in the same room together, we sat down and did some very rough sketches of what those kind of pod shapes would look like. And then we started to make them. And then, of course, obviously, what we ended up making was kind of different from what we started drawing because it evolved. And we've also ended up with 9 of them, although at least several people have suggested we should make more. And somebody who shall be nameless suggested we made 40, which is not really practicable.
No.
At the time.
No, not at all. And they're all different in that they're all slightly different sizes, and they all have different levels of opening and closing to them. So some of them are very, very closed and sort of with slight perforations or slight openings, and some of them are very open. And it also plays to that idea around our relationship with the outside world. So in some ways, the internal mosaic pods are a little bit personified. And that the net that surrounds them is also a metaphor for the home in a way, that or the confinement, and with different aspects or levels of opening and closing, damage, perfection. And we're also trying to make reference to the relationship people have then with confinement, and also then to the outside world. And I do think in some ways, for some people, lockdown has really changed their relationship with the outside world. And as Marian was saying earlier, the relationship, the different ways that we've each been required to adapt, or the adaptation that we've all undertaken in terms of our social roles and our work roles through this process. But another really key component in the series is the copper knitting, which is really Marian. Marian has done all the copper knitting, and it's been taken to a whole new level in this series, Marian. How did that happen?
Yeah, well, I knew that we wanted to incorporate it, and I went on a copper knitting class about 3 years ago now, with the aim of incorporating it into my own practice. And I had been, but on much kind of flatter surfaces, so not flat, because people who know me know I barely ever work flat, but flattish, I guess. And this was a big leap into the kind of three-dimensional aspect of it. So some of the knitting is actually wrapping around the pod, some of it is kind of loose over the pod, some of it is actually kind of springing off the pod shape. And I did offer to teach Caitlin how to do this, but she refused my kind offer. So it kind of, the starting point left was me to actually physically do it. But whenever we were incorporating it, we always talked about it beforehand and how we envisaged it. Although that did actually change from time to time. I mean, this little one that we're seeing at the moment, which is really quite small, started off being encased by this bigger pod, and then we didn't like it, so we took it out and put knitting around it. And then we thought that was kind of too small. It's really small, that one. It's kind of yay big. And so we gave it a kind of bigger overcoat to make it take up more space on the wall. So it was a very kind of evolutionary process. And also, it wasn't just me doing it in terms of, Caitlin was obviously involved in the planning and deciding what I would make, but also once I'd made it, Caitlin then kind of charged in, and she distressed it, and we cut more holes in things, and although I deliberately put holes in some of them, and Caitlin was patination person in chief as well, which was great fun.
Yeah, so that first one we looked at, this is it now, because we ended up, it's a bit cropped. We didn't like it on its first little pod. So this is it cut open, and then it's now on a new one, which is this one, which is starting to come together. And you can see the shim that we've got in there too, that we're trying to incorporate elements of the metal within the pod as well as around the pod. And we had some, we did put some parameters on. Again, collaboration, there always needs to be some parameters. Otherwise, where do you stop? Where do you start? So we with Australia, as you've just seen earlier, we had the parameters of the actual outline of the shape, which was, not something that you could really change. Whereas with this, there are no parameters. So how do we, try to create something that is, that works, that's diverse, that speaks to both of our skills and the concepts? So one of the things we did do was we limited our colour palette. So you'll notice that most of the pieces have the copper knitting as well as mainly blues and metallics and natural stone and black. So this was there are some pieces that have had elements of other colours popped into them, but in general, we've sticked to that limited colour palette. And one thing that is very interesting is how the colour or the feeling of the pod changes after patination. So this is probably our favourite one. We agree this is our favourite one. I have kind of love-hate relationships with them. Like one of them at the moment I absolutely hate. I have to talk to you about that, Marian. I can't start. I've decided I don't like it at all. And this one I think we both love. So it's interesting how we each have positive and negative relationships with different forms, and then there's that negotiation process that we have around what we include and what we exclude. The other thing to point out is not everything that we've made is actually included, which is another really important point when you're working with a body of work. Just because you've made it doesn't mean it's good and doesn't mean it should go in. And just because we both made it and we're experienced doesn't mean it's good. So we can, you know, go backwards and forwards about what might be included and what might not be. But this is our favorite. I think we agree. Do you agree?
Okay, can I just interject very quickly
Yes.
to kind of emphasize what you're saying, that this whole collaboration process, particularly with this piece, I think, this little body of work, it's not a straight line. It's not like you start at the beginning and you end up at the end. You kind of go a bit and then you double back and then you take a bit out, you rub a bit out of the line, if you like, and then you kind of carry on and then you see what it looks like at the end and you jiggle it again. It's a very evolving process.
Absolutely. And the work changes too. So this is the fresh copper, and you can see that the colors on this pot are particularly bright, and we can see inside the pot here, and we're trying to get this internal external thing going on as well. So I might make a substrate, then Marian might make mosaic inside it, then I would take it and mosaic the outside of it, which is what happened here. And then I would take it back and then I would patinate it. So my patination, I'm really just using a evaporated vinegar as my patination method. So my kitchen and my studio have smelt rather like salt and vinegar chips for quite some time. My boyfriend was very confused when he came over and saw pots all around the kitchen. He said, "What are you cooking?" He went up and took the lid out, and there was a mosaic in there, and he was basically knocked out by vinegar. So this is what's been happening in the studio and at home, because the vinegar is at the bottom and the gases are evaporating. It's evaporating up into the air, and then the patination occurs on the copper. And it isn't necessarily a permanent thing, so it's constantly changing as it interacts with the air. So we've been swapping backwards and forwards, lots of photographs and videos of the process. What do you think of this? What do you think of that? What about this? What about that? As we exchange our piece. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that, Marian?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was sort of particularly interesting in terms of how different this collaboration was to Australia. Because on Australia, although we were working on one piece, we each had our defined areas, which were defined by the contour lines. So, you know, I did one bit, Caitlin did the next bit, I did the next bit, and so on. And with this, it's been a much kind of closer collaboration, if you like. And I think it's resulted in a synergy in a way that Australia didn't. Like, Australia was one thing we made together, but because, you know, as Caitlin said, one of us would start the substrate, the other would start the mosaic, then it would go back, I would put the knitting at some point, the other person would then complete it. So you were actually working on a surface with somebody else's existing mosaic, and you had to make it both tie in, but also not lose your kind of individual voice. And what's been really interesting for me is how much I think this has really become more than the sum of its parts. And there are some where, like that one, I know who did which on it, because basically Caitlin did the front and I did the back. But there are others where one person has started and the others finished, where I look at it and I go, oh, I'm not actually sure which of our hands is where, which I think has made it, you know, really, really interesting. And I know one kind of probably shouldn't say this about one's own work, but I look at these, and every time I look at them, somebody once said to me that when they looked at my work, it made their stomach hurt, which he meant in a really good way. And this is that feeling that I get from looking at this series. I just get this kind of visceral kind of whoa at it. Partly, I think, because of the collaboration between the media. So the way that the knitting has been used, which I think, you know, lots of people have used wire and copper and other stuff. We're not, you know, originators in this, but I think we're the only people doing it like this. And I just find it incredibly exciting. Say it as shouldn't.
That's wonderful. I might just maybe ask this question on behalf of Michalina, because it relates directly to what you, Marian and Caitlin, were just saying. And she's basically asking, did your previous collaboration make this project go easier? Do you think collaborating repeatedly with the same person is beneficial? Or do you think you will look to engage with others in the future too?
Ooh, Caitlin, do you want to start that one?
Yeah, definitely. So I think that Australia was a catalyst for our collaborative process. And this is a development of it. So we've both discussed continuing the series, whether we make more. I think I have a few things I need to do before that, like make the rest of the work for the exhibition, which is coming up very quickly. But then I'd be very open to that. And I think we are getting to know each other's working methods and patterns, and it's starting, you know, it has worked really well. I mean, we really haven't had any issues at all, have we, Marian, with this? No. Yeah, great question though. Excellent question.
And I think, I mean, we've both worked a lot with other people before. I mean, we both teach. We've both done community projects. We've both done big projects for commissions where we're leading teams. And I think all kind of that experience helps.
Kristen has made a note about the shadows, and I really agree. So when we install the work, we're going to need to sort of consider that in the lighting.
Absolutely.
And how the shadows activate the form. So we've done a bit of a draft hang in my studio. It looks a bit clumsy, but it's to get the idea of how the pieces might work with shadow as well, and the play on light, which is a critical thing that we all understand and love in mosaic, is that the way the light plays on the form, and these things are kinetic, so they move in the ambient air. So as they move, again, the light changes and the shadows change. So there's a lot of things going on in that we need to work out in terms of how it's going to be installed. Well, I think I'll formally say thank you to Marian. Thank you so much to Marian for that. Thank you.